Hello. Let's begin with a short silent meditation. Okay. One of the themes that we've talked about, especially part of the larger theme of an emergent spirituality, is excuse me, the concept of a complete path, kind of an integral or comprehensive human path. Towards this end, the vision of a comprehensive human spirituality, there's quite a few different components of that. As I've indicated before, for me, one of the core principles that I think is the deepest context for the most embracing spirituality is what is often called a non-dual vision, non-dual philosophy, and ultimately experience. But within that framework, there's a lot of components that help illuminate the sense of a balanced and complete approach, one that we've talked about to some extent so far, is the notion of a kind of a basic polarity to human nature and to reality. Shiva and Shakti, yin and yang, masculine and feminine. And this, I think this is important in a number of different ways. One of them is that it helps to clarify and deepen our appreciation of a point of view that's more balanced and inclusive of all aspects of our nature. It's very easy to settle into an understanding or an approach that can become somewhat lopsided. And so to understand the subtleties of what it can mean to understand ourselves and reality, and subsequently also our spiritual practice, in terms of the distinction of basic polarity like Shiva and Shakti, is very important and very empowering. And it also, I think, in a larger sense, is an important part of the description of what the emerging spirit of a new Dharma is in the world, because in my appraisal, most of the traditions that exist do tend to have their strengths and weaknesses. They do tend to lean in one direction or another. So if we find ourselves sometimes unknowingly in the midst of or being exposed to or participating in a teaching or tradition or practice that's out of balance, sometimes that can have a perfectly positive effect on us and bring us into greater balance, but sometimes it can exaggerate a pre-existing imbalance. So it can be very useful. In fact, I feel it ultimately is inevitably useful to understand these different perspectives, like fundamentally non-dualism, and then that framework, a basic vision like the balance of opposites, the balance of fundamental polarities. Another aspect that we've touched upon, and I want to go into a little bit more deeply today, is the notion of an even more multifaceted perspective of human nature. This comes up in a number of different contexts. For instance, the fact that we have 7 major chakras, or that human nature seems to ultimately span 7 realms of existence, not only the physical world, but subtler worlds, and in fact, very less familiar, formless realms beyond 7 altogether. Many traditions, such as the Hindu, talk of 7 lokas that correspond to the 7 chakras. And these can sound kind of, inspiring or fascinating or exotic, but they also has a practical value to understand this vision of 7, just in the same way as understanding polarity has value. And one of the reasons why is because even though traditionally the chakra system is sometimes viewed as, in part, among other things, a kind of developmental model where the less developed chakras are the lower chakras, and we move upward as we mature spiritually. There's another point of view where each of the chakras has its own place in human nature, its own value, its own contribution, and in a certain sense they're all equal in status. And in fact, the higher chakras are just as capable of being focal points of confusion and misguided energy and obstruction as the lower chakras are. It isn't a given, for instance, and I think we know this from our own experience. Just because we have, say, an ajna center or brow chakra doesn't mean that this chakra is always functioning as this illumined, intuitive, wise center. In all of us, it needs to be awakened and transformed and illuminated. So how is that any different than the so-called lower chakras that seem to need to go through a healing and transformation and purification as well? So for me, I think there's greater value in understanding that each of the chakras is part of human nature. Each of the chakras can function in a more problematic modality where it's a focus of ignorance and confusion and attachment and obstruction, or it can be kind of middle-ish, which relative to ordinary human experience is sort of normal. It's not experienced as acutely problematic, but relative to deeper spiritual ideas of profound love and contentment and enlightenment, those, even at that level of functioning, the chakras, the energies in them, end up being something that needs to be transformed and illuminated. So each of the chakras is capable of also functioning at this deepest level of being a focal point of a deeply illumined consciousness. And it's my experience that there's really no substitution one chakra for another. Each of them has a place. Each of them holds its own sacred vibration and presence and capacities even, and qualities. So what might be called an integral spirituality needs to include all of the chakras, and especially in this a sort of appreciation of the way in which each makes its own unique contribution to our total human nature. So in that sense, we could say that at the heart of enlightenment, call it, Buddhic consciousness, enlightenment, self-realization, God consciousness, Christ consciousness, at the essence of that is this difficult to describe, mysterious realization and beingness that ultimately I feel at the deepest levels is virtually impossible to put into words. We can use words to kind of point at it. We can use words to try to refine our understanding of what it is and what it isn't. But ultimately, none of the words that we can come up with will capture, especially if those words are qualities or characteristics. Even to say that it's non-dual, for instance, isn't quite right, because it's even more subtle than that. It's even more transcendent than that. And it's even more intimate than that. Like normally we, in the spiritual context, in these philosophies, we might think of the ordinary human experience of the physical world and our human nature as being dualistic. And so when we say non-dual, it somehow implies that it's other than that. But in fact, it's not other than that. It's more closer to the reality of being the true nature of everything that we ordinarily experience. And that true nature isn't something that can be captured in philosophical concepts like, unity or dualism or non-dualism, or that even, so however our personal preferences, we can just say generally that there's a dimension of reality that is actually the true nature of all dimensions of reality. A type of experience that we'll call the mysticism, the transcendent, the non-dual. And it's not somewhere else. It's the very nature of every dimension of experience, every aspect of experience, every being is part of this reality in a way that's impossible to describe. We can only contemplate it and be it, but we can't really adequately conceptualize it or express it. But as we do actualize this realization, things happen. So we can kind of talk about, well, maybe we can't exactly nail down what this is in some kind of philosophical or psychological or verbal way, even visually in symbols, but the you might say kind of like side effects, the implications of our growing realization of that reality are things that we can talk about. For instance, people just seem to become more peaceful. In fact, very blissful ultimately. They tend to become much more content and not as engaged in the sense that there's something lacking in themselves, that they're deficient, that they're not okay, that they need something outside of themselves. These qualities gradually seem to fall away. So we can talk about many facets, many ways in which there are implications to this growing transcendent realization. And one of the most classic ways to do that is to talk about various qualities that emerge in our experience, like contentment and peace and bliss, but also love and compassion, generosity and strength and courage and confidence and humility and equanimity and acceptance. All of these are sort of like the flowering of this realization. None of them alone can quite capture the fullness of it, because they're all part of a larger pattern of fullness, and we need the whole picture to complete that expression. So one way to talk about it is it's sort of a balanced and full maturation of all these qualities. And that's another reason why this system of it's probably in a very experiential way, it's in part based on the chakra system. We have these 7 chakras. That's a debatable point. Some people believe that some traditions and teachings suggest that there's actually 9 major chakras or 5 major chakras. In Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, it's probably most commonly referred to as a 5 chakra system. But in fact, the Tibetans also, there's texts that talk about other numbers as well, certainly 7 or 4. It kind of depends on the practice and what exactly you're working with. But in a kind of, it's my suggestion that as we develop an increasingly global and sort of non-sectarian, non-doctrinaire approach to spirituality, where we just kind of investigate these things free from attachments to points of view, and just see what the truth is and compare our experiences. My guess is that we're going to continue to discover that there are 7 primary chakras, and that's just kind of like the reality, in the same way that a scientist will say, well, are we still debating what the chemical composition of water is? H2O. There's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen atom in each molecule of H2O. That's not really, to my knowledge, that's not really an ongoing debate. There's a certain clarity that's arisen in chemistry and physics, where we just kind of know, well, pretty confidently, nothing's absolute in science, but it seems to be that. I think the same thing will happen in spirituality. We'll see that the consciousness and the sort of spiritual structure of not only human nature, but the macrocosm has a tremendous order to it, and that one of the basic orderings is that there are 7 worlds, 7 chakras, 7 elements, and many other sevens, you might say. It's a recurring pattern. It's a fundamental sort of structure in relativity. So at one level, there's the primordial reality. At another level, there's the fundamental realities of Shiva and Shakti. And a third very important level is that this the septenary or 7-fold system of reality that is very profound, and is actually a very extensive science, especially in some traditions like the Hindu tradition. The application of this 7-fold system is very extensive. And in the Trans-Himalayan system that many people are familiar with these days, that was first introduced to the world more openly through Blavatsky and Theosophy, it's even more, it's hinted at that it's actually an even more comprehensive and vast science of intuitive spiritual science there as well. Yes, indeed. So, of course, we're not going to take time right now to go into the broader implications of that science. I'm bringing it up in this context because it has very practical usefulness in our own spiritual practice if we're interested in pursuing that. And one of the ways that that's the case is because invariably, it's interesting to notice that even though some systems don't really emphasize, for instance, working with chakras, most systems talk about them. A system that's commonly thought to really not deal with chakras very much, for instance, is Theravada Buddhism, the oldest school of Buddhism. There's not quite as much overt discussion of chakras, for instance, and energy centers. That's because it's a Shiva-leaning system, you might say. What do I mean by that? Well, earlier I was saying, another basic distinction is the polarity of Shiva and Shakti. Part of what Shiva means is that Shiva has more to do with the principle of consciousness, the experience of understanding and awareness. And Shakti is more connected to energy and form. So for instance, if we're working with chakras and Kundalini and prana and the breath and so on, that's kind of more of a Shakti-leaning system and practice. But if we're doing something like Vipassana or Zazen, where the primary emphasis is on awareness, mindfulness, observation, that's kind of a Shiva-leaning approach. Well, all systems have some of both, but Theravada Buddhism in its kind of traditional form leans a bit towards the wisdom, Shiva, awareness, even the core naming of the tradition itself, Buddhism, comes of course from the Buddha having acquired the title of the Buddha, and that phrase comes from Buddhi, and it's sort of used in Buddhism in this context. The Buddha meant the awakened one. And wakefulness is more of a Shiva principle. It describes more. He didn't say I'm the enlivened one, which would be kind of more of a Shakti way of talking about himself. He said I'm the awake one. So nonetheless, in spite of the fact that traditional texts and descriptions of practices in Theravada Buddhism aren't terribly Shakti-oriented, actually, it's been found by Western practitioners who have gone to Asia and studied, in Thailand and Burma and India, that is not at all uncommon actually in these training systems for there to be as a sort of secondary part of the system, an acknowledgement of the chakras and a recognition of different kinds of practices that work with the energies of the chakras. In fact, there's one teacher in Burma, if I remember, U Ba Khin. Yeah, he was a Burmese meditation master. He coined a phrase, well, I'll put it in a sort of the Sanskrit version, is Nirvana Dhatu. And what that means is the sort of element, or you might say energy of nirvana. And what he meant by that was that if you do Vipassana and you get deep enough into a state of intuitive insight into the nature of what's arising, and you see the impermanence of it, and you just have a growing intuitive recognition of what's arising in your experience, that'll activate this energy in your body. He called Nirvana Dhatu, or Nibbana Dhatu in Pali. And this, he said, was a kind of a heat and a vibration that would awaken in your body and start purifying your karma and move through your body, and often had a burning sensation to it. Well, this is obviously a description of Kundalini. So it's inevitable that even if you have a system that kind of leans a bit towards the Shiva side, awareness of these things like the Shakti side invariably comes out. And so sometimes it gets acknowledged, sometimes it's just said, well, yeah, that's just stuff that happens, and we don't really name it, and we don't work with it directly. We just sit and do our zazen, and then stuff happens, and yes, energies open and move around in the body, and well, a more complete approach would include both of these. But even in the Theravada Buddhist system, there's a recognition of 7 elements, for instance, which brings us back to the 7 chakras and the 7 facets of human nature that are reflected in those chakras. So an important value in recognizing these basic chakras is that, for instance, it's quite possible, for instance, to become out of balance in our development of the chakras. One way that this can happen is that we just pursue a specific kind of practice that, whether we know it or not, emphasizes a particular chakra or at least a region of the body. Let's say it's more head-centered. I've made reference, for instance, to practices like the gazing one, where you look into your inner field of vision and just witness what's arising there. Inevitably, this is going to energize the head chakras stronger than, say, chakras lower in the body. There's a lot of positive aspects to a practice like that, but for some people, it can lead to imbalances. It can lead to ungroundedness or headaches or over-energizing in other ways the head centers. And so understanding that there are actually 7 chakras and we want to keep them in relative balance helps us to have a system of understanding where we can recognize when balances are arising, understanding how to shift our practice if that happens. So for instance, if we find that headiness happening, but let's say it's just mild, one way to balance that would be to bring into our awareness a greater sense of the presence of our body as a whole. So that even if we continue with the practice where we're gazing, we kind of develop a sort of inclusive awareness where we're also more deeply in touch with the felt sense of our body, a grounded sense of, being in a body. Because it's easy if you're just gazing into the inner space, it'll actually ultimately lead to leaving your body altogether, forgetting about the physical plane, which has its values, but also can lead to, other potentially, for some people, it never has a negative side effect, especially if the person starts off as somebody who's kind of let's say a sacral center person or a solar plexus person. What I mean by that is that their kind of nature is more connected to those qualities than others. Then if they do a practice like that, it will tend to have a balancing effect very often, let's say, at least, and they might not run into many negative side effects or any. But if a person is already kind of heady and then they do a practice like that, there's a decent chance they can run into negative side effects, and then not understanding how to balance them. And so understanding the nature of the chakras, the qualities associated with them, the aspects of human nature like emotion, physicalness, or mind or intuition that can be associated with different chakras more than others, the elements that are connected to those chakras, all of that gradually, as we learn more about that, it helps to have a more sort of healthy, balanced experience of spiritual development. So one way to work with that is on a more bodily level, an energetic level as chakras. But another way to work with these, this sevenfold system, is in terms of the inner spiritual qualities and principles connected to those chakras. Because the chakras really aren't the source of these energies. They're more like the way that those energies interact with our personal energy system, our etheric or pranic body. That's where we have these chakras, and ultimately, therefore, with our physical body. But we can also explore these energies in a way that's not as necessarily connected to the chakras as focal points in our body. And one of those is as qualities. Some people have become a little bit more familiar with that in recent years, and really probably in the last century or so. Some of the Western esoteric schools started talking about this, even in the late 1800s. As qualities, they're sometimes referred to as the seven rays. In fact, the concept of the seven rays in its ancient form goes back many thousands of years. Some people would say even longer than that. And in the deepest sense, the concept of the seven rays is very multifaceted, but one of the most popular and commonly talked about versions or aspects of the seven rays is as spiritual qualities. There's, again, a variety of reasons why it can be very useful to understand that system. One reason is it's simply a good description of the full curriculum of human spiritual development. In other words, we're not here, when we signed on as spiritual beings to incarnate in the human kingdom, it's specifically in part to embrace a spiritual journey that will ultimately include development of all of these qualities. So to understand that all of those qualities are there, and their nature is a profound part of understanding the human experience, because it helps us have a kind of important key to understanding, well, what am I trying to realize here? Now, each of us has a tendency to be stronger in some of these qualities than others, so there's a natural tendency to kind of lean towards those and emphasize those. And that's fine. That's an important recognition. It helps us to understand certain things about our nature and experience. But also, it's important to understand that no specific quality, let's say love, for instance, can really reach its fullest stage of development without being balanced with all the other qualities. All of the qualities actually support and, in a sense, kind of define each other. So without wisdom and strength and equanimity and devotion and other qualities, love can't really reach its highest, most mature, most balanced form of expression. This is why the Buddha talked about the notion of bodhisattvahood. Essentially, one way of talking about what the Buddha meant when he talked about bodhisattvahood is that it's the fullest understanding, certainly within the context of Buddhism, of recognizing all of these different aspects of human nature, our potential to develop all of these qualities, and to enter upon a path and a practice that ultimately will lead to the perfect balance and fullest expression of all of these qualities. Because it's not necessary in order to achieve liberation, in order to achieve a certain measure of mystical realization, or even let's call it non-dual presence or non-dual awakening. It's not necessary to develop all these qualities equally. We can be a kind of specialist. Let's say our path is devotion and surrender, and that perhaps we have entered on a path where we have a kind of chosen deity. It could be the God of Christianity, or Jesus, or even Mary, or it could be Isis, or it could be Avalokiteshvara, or Rama, or Kali. So there's innumerable faces of deity, and the devotee loves this more personal approach generally, and will cultivate a kind of loving, surrendered, deep devotion to a deity as the basic path. Naturally, it's not at all uncommon for, say, a bhakti, as they would call such a person in the Hindu tradition, somebody on a more devotional path, to be equally balanced in other qualities. Last week I mentioned, for instance, that there's a whole other path that's more energy, skill, mastery oriented, like Qigong. And more often than not, your classical bhakti or devotee isn't as well developed in that area. What the Buddha described was a path where he said, in order to reach the fullest expression of an ability to serve enlightenment in the world, to serve humanity, and indeed to serve collective evolution, the fullest way to do that is to bring all of these potentials of human nature, all of the qualities, all of the capacities, all of the chakras into their fullest expression. And in fact, for me, I would perhaps take the idea a step further and say that path is inevitable. It's inevitable that each of us has a destiny of doing that. We might not do it on this planet. We might not do it in this cycle of human incarnations. We might decide that getting far enough along in that process to lead us to complete our karmic development as a human being and attain a state, for instance, where we're not required to come back. We're not generating any, we've attained a state of interdependent realization, of interconnectedness, where we're not generating a sense of suffering and karma and dualism in our own lives anymore. And at that point, there's no requirement to come back. But actually, at that point, we won't have attained the most balanced and fullest expression of all these seven facets of human nature. This is why the Buddha suggested that one needs to renounce final nirvana on the path of bodhisattvahood in order to attain full Buddhahood or complete development of all these qualities. Because if you, upon the point of getting partially the way there, you can choose at that point, because of having attained personal nirvana, which simply means you have enough realization now that you no longer are experiencing yourself as a separate being, and you therefore aren't creating karma anymore that ties you to the world. You can just decide at that point to enter a state called parinirvana, where you drop awareness of all the realms and you merge into another order of reality. That's impossible to describe. It doesn't, to me, mean that you don't exist as a being anymore. It's just not part of samsara, part of the dimensions of suffering. But it's my understanding, my inclination is to believe that because you hadn't attained the fullest expression of self-realization, of Buddhahood, of Christ consciousness, that eventually in some other cycle, perhaps in some other world, you will come back again in order to continue on. And to put it in this context, it's to continue the path of bodhisattvahood. And not, we can describe why in a variety of ways, but one of those is, in a sense, your growing non-dual realization will compel you to, because non-dual or comprehensive or transcendent realization embraces everything and inevitably leads to the fullest expression of all aspects of human nature. So, in a sense, what the Buddha was saying when he said, well, this is kind of optional. You can just attain personal liberation and do some work perhaps along the way to help other beings, but once having achieved personal liberation, you can kind of slip off into parinirvana at the end of that incarnation. Or you could renounce that. That doesn't mean that you can't attain some measure of non-dual realization. You just wouldn't bring it to such a point of development that it negates your interest. You wouldn't develop it in a way that would negate your interest in coming back, so to speak, to participating in ongoing evolution and enlightenment. And often it's referred to as an act of self-sacrifice and compassion. And that's true. Very often it's felt that way. For some beings, though, it's actually just felt to be an expression of enlightenment, in the sense that they simply understand that they haven't achieved the deepest level of realization yet, and the only way to do that is to keep coming back. It's like they got their bachelor's degree, but in order to get the PhD, the bachelor's is enough to not have to come back. But if something inside of some people just says, that's not enough, I need to keep going. I need to, and I think that impulse to keep going is actually hidden deep within all beings. And so even if you take a vacation, you might say, and go off into parinirvana for a while, eventually, a million years from now, that'll bring you back. It'll say, okay, that's a nice long rest, but I'm incomplete. There's something more. And it's not that I feel like I'm lacking in the sense of that I'm not whole. It's more like there's a greater fullness, a greater actualization of reality through my individual nature that just inevitably has to happen. So these beings come back at some other point and they continue on. So from my point of view, I feel like people need to know that there's this option, but they also need to know the practical realities of what the implications of these choices are. And if we choose this path of personal liberation, there's nothing morally wrong about that. But my strong suspicion is that you're not really done when you do that. You will come back. There will be further evolution. So the argument could be made, why delay? Why put that off? Why not just continue on? And in the context of Buddhism, that's called the path of bodhisattvahood. It doesn't need to be understood in that way. It can called, it could just be called, for instance, the path to complete human enlightenment, or the path of compassion and love and service, or the path of participating in collective evolution. There's many ways to look at it. They all kind of ultimately mean the same thing. They're just different facets of the same truth. So it isn't a requirement that you seek to balance all these qualities in your path. But I will suggest that you might want to consider the possibility that it is inevitable that you will eventually. So perhaps it's useful just to kind of realize that at this stage, if we haven't already, and just begin to include that in our curriculum. But we don't necessarily need to do that in some kind of overwhelmingly burdensome way where we think, oh, there's so much work to do. It's like you arrive at university and you think, I've got to take all these classes all at the same time. No, there's another way to go about that, where we kind of start where we are and honor the reality of where we are. Let's say if I'm a bhakti-leaning person, a devotionally leaning person. So I just honor that and I embrace that as the heart of my path. And then in a way that's more kind of natural and organic, I just include other aspects of my development. I expand out. I might discover a phase where I start to become a little more philosophical, and the concept of a deep quality of awareness and wisdom and understanding is growing. And so then I start to add that component to my development. Or at some point I wasn't that interested in it, and now I find that chakras and energies and pranas and kundalini and breathing practices is coming alive for me. I see the value in that. By the way, it's very interesting to look around that there are some examples in our world. I think perhaps one of the great examples of a more comprehensive Buddha type manifestation is the great Tibetan master Padmasambhava. Really, as far as we understand, profoundly embodied all of these different facets. He had a deeply devotional nature. He was profoundly wise. He had profound paranormal abilities and great mastery of energy and nature forces. And he understood the chakras and these energies and so breathing practices, and all of this was incorporated in profound philosophical and non-dual sort of jnani, to use the Sanskrit word, a wisdom component. He embraced Dzogchen in the basic broader context of the sort of non-dual wisdom of Buddhism. He was obviously a very powerful leader type, and founded, was a key founding figure, perhaps the most significant founding figure of Tibetan Buddhism. So many different facets of his nature developed to an extraordinary degree. And there are other examples. I think Shankara was a good example of this kind of thing. Of course, the Buddha, Jesus. According to teachers like Daskalos, it's interesting to discover that Daskalos was very keen on the idea that's not an uncommon one, that Jesus taught both a kind of outer general teaching to humanity and an esoteric teaching to the inner circles. And this esoteric teaching was actually very sophisticated and included, among other things, a great deal of energy mastery work. It was very technical. It involved understanding chakras and the subtle bodies and out-of-body work and kundalini. And that was according to Daskalos, who is perhaps the sort of, to my mind, one of the leading esoteric experts of the 20th century in esoteric Christianity. By his personal memories and his study of the Akashic records, he insists that this is an integral part of what Jesus taught. That it was a very rich, wasn't a sort of simple bhakti path. It was multifaceted and very sophisticated. Um, so I think, again, it's likely that Jesus was another example of somebody who was very complete and rich in this multifaceted development. Of course, even at very advanced stages, masters will still have a subtle leaning. They'll still have a tendency to, like the Buddha, as extraordinarily advanced as he was, I think it's not that big of a stretch to suggest that he still had a leaning towards what would be called the second ray, the wisdom ray. And Jesus perhaps towards love and devotion. But the more advanced such individuals become, the more completely balanced. And essentially what a being like a so-called planetary logos, as it's sometimes called, like the primordial world master, you might say, the Jagat Guru, as the Hindus say, the world guru. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Is believed and experienced by many people to be a fully balanced manifestation of human qualities and traits and paths. They're all expressed within this one being. And of course, that would make sense. Like if they're, it's believed in many traditions, from Taoists to Buddhists, Hindus, Rosicrucians, and Sufis, and certain esoteric schools of the Jewish tradition, that there not only is a hidden group of masters in the world and in the inner dimensions that embody a much more comprehensive understanding of spirituality and fulfill functions on a more global and planetary scale as well. But there is a primordial being, a single individual, who is for our planet the sum total of planetary mastery, planetary enlightenment. And for such a being to be able to embody that function, of course they would need to be able to acknowledge each path with equal balance, with equal honor of that specific approach. It really wouldn't be ideal for such a person to have a strong bias, for instance, towards, let's say, the technical approach. How could they be a global teacher to all types of paths, to all types of masters, all types of bodhisattvas, all types of students, all types of religions? They would need to be a fairly balanced expression of all of these paths. So naturally, when that group that's on the path to developing that under the guidance of the planetary Christ or planetary Buddha or whatever we want to call this being, I'm not saying this being is specifically Christ or Jesus or the Buddha. In fact, there's somewhat of a debate. Naturally, different spiritual traditions would like to think that the head of their religion is also the planetary, the planetary headmaster. So some esoteric Christians think it's Jesus or somebody else in that lineage, or the Buddhists might think it's the Buddha. The Taoists might think it's Lao Tse, or the Hindus might say it's Shankara or it's Sanat Kumar or whomever. So I'm not going to take a position on that issue at the moment, but let's just say there is such a being. My experience of this being is that they are profoundly balanced, and subsequently they teach a balanced path. Like the general leaning is, if you're going, especially for those who either have a kind of loving bodhisattvic spirit, or in general have a dharma to embrace this larger path of extended spiritual evolution beyond normal human liberation or human enlightenment, the deeper curriculum of human awakening. Invariably, the training is to embrace this balanced approach to spiritual development. So the comprehensive lineages, the ones that are closer to kind of training some of these global bodhisattvas, like Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, they're also comprehensive traditions that embrace all these different facets. That's certainly true of some of the other major traditions like Taoism or Hinduism. You can find within these traditions all of these different facets are represented well. So on a more practical level, what we can look at is, well, what is a foundational way to begin understanding what these different qualities are and what kind of relevance they have to our own spiritual development. Well, we've talked about a number of these qualities, of course, already. We just haven't maybe specifically emphasized looking at them in the context of the 7 rays. But it can be useful to do that. Let's check the time here. Okay, we have a little bit more time before the break. A version of this was taught by the Buddha when he taught the spiritual practice of Vipassana. It's not necessarily a complete version of the 7 rays, but it's a good step in that direction. So I'm going to talk about it very briefly now. The Buddha called these the 7 factors of enlightenment. And they're not exactly the same as the 7 rays, but there's some overlap. And the reason that he talked about these is his notion was that as you develop your spiritual practice, whether it's mindfulness in day-to-day life or it's in a Vipassana practice particularly, you ultimately want to bring all of these qualities into balanced development. And the 7 factors of enlightenment start with mindfulness, or it sometimes can just be more generally called awareness. So that aspect of our spiritual cultivation, that's simply the experience of strengthening, being aware, being conscious. And in many ways, this is a very particularly fundamental quality, because without awareness, we really aren't in a position to develop the other qualities. We have to begin by kind of waking up in the moments and being mindful of the reality that we're conscious beings and we have intentionality and we can choose to foster our own spiritual development. And so if we want to cultivate a quality like peace, we have to be mindful moment to moment of the option to try to be more peaceful, try to let go of tensions and stress and attachments and anxiousness and impatience, and just relax in the moment, try to be more peaceful. So mindfulness plays a key role in the development of other qualities. It's not the only quality that's key, but so it's both one of the 7, but it's also a particularly important one because it's so foundational. Another quality is equanimity, of Buddha's 7 qualities of enlightenment. A third is effort, intentionality, that energy that kind of, it's sort of very deeply mixed up with, it seems like we can split up these qualities. In a certain sense we can, but in that moment, for instance, of awakening and mindfulness, there's often an energetic component to it, like that contributes to the sensation of, even if in a very subtle way, of a moment of greater awareness, like, oh, awakening. I'm back to, here I am involved in some activity, and I notice I come back to a kind of something in me, some leads to me becoming conscious of, oh, here I am in the midst of my life, and forgetting about me, trying to remain more detached and calm and compassionate, and I'm going to work with that now. And that intention, both that energy of awakening and then the following attention to, so what am I going to do with that, is this component of effort and intentionality. That's a multifaceted one. We'll come back to that. Other qualities are tranquility, as I said, equanimity, investigation. An interesting one that has a somewhat unusual name to it is rapture. Rapture, I would say, is probably one of the hardest qualities for people to understand, partially because most people especially when they begin meditation, don't necessarily, or spiritual practice in general, aren't feeling rapture. So what is meant by that? Well, one of the things that's fascinating about, let's say, for instance, in the context of meditation practices, a certain stage of concentration and presence and acceptance and so on in meditation invariably leads to, just inevitably, it's built into the process, leads to the release of rapture. And this rapture can take many different forms. One of the most basic forms is that it's a sensation of energy. And often that sensation is very positive. It's like, it can be a feeling of elation. It can be a feeling of bliss. It can be a feeling of pins and needles moving through the body, or a feeling of lightness, like you're floating. Or, in fact, this principle of rapture, as the way it's defined in this context in Buddhism, is actually a very rich, multifaceted dimension. And in fact, it includes a lot of what comes underneath the principle of Kundalini awakening in the Shakti and Kundalini traditions. So a lot of what people experience, that where there's phenomena that result from Kundalini awakening, Buddhists would often call all of that rapture. And some of it isn't even necessarily comfortable, but sort of it's sometimes just sort of generally included under this category of rapture, even though some of it can be like difficult karmas working out, or peculiar experiences, like an odd one that sometimes people experience at certain stages. They might feel their subtle body shift in relationship to their physical body, so that you kind of sense that your physical body is sitting in a certain posture, but your subtle body shifts, so it feels like it's like maybe sideways inside your physical body. You feel like you're tilted. Or you might feel like you've just dissociated from your body and you're behind it. I knew a fellow in the 1980s who, at a fairly young age, went off to Asia and did extensive, he was about 16 years old at the time, and he did extensive Vipassana retreats in Asia. And at one point, he suddenly just started having out-of-body experiences. He would just pop right out of his body, and he'd find himself hovering around or above his physical body. But because it wasn't something he was intending to have happen, and in a sense, it was probably primarily the result of a very rigorous meditation practice. So it was kind of very prematurely, you might even say, kind of, it was uncomfortable for him. It was just disarming. He wasn't ready to have that experience. He had to go to his teachers and talk it through. And, they tried to encourage him to understand that this was just a normal thing and not to be worried about it, just keep observing, as it's just considered just more phenomena that's arising. But he was at a stage, he was only 16, probably wasn't quite ready to be meditating quite as much as he was. So he just couldn't get over that. It just felt disturbing to him, and it caused him to just want to stop meditating for years, and he didn't go back until he was in his 20s. So sometimes, depending on the person, their stage of development, or their type and the type of phenomenon, some of these, what can be kind of generally called rapture type experiences, can be uncomfortable for various reasons. But treated wisely, in the context of a balanced understanding of how to proceed with spiritual practice and how to handle phenomena, things like that don't necessarily need to become a problem. Or and there's ways, like if you pop out of your body, there's ways to learn to reground. That would be a good example of where the chakras and the elements and the rays come in. As in, by working, for instance, with certain practices that help to connect more to, say, the earth element, one can reintegrate with the body better and not feel what can be, for some, these disturbing experiences of feeling ungrounded or disconnected to the body, out of the body, or otherwise, what some people feel are uncomfortable spaces sometimes. So that's a version of 7. I think we covered many of them: awareness, concentration, equanimity, investigation, effort, rapture, and tranquility. Those are the 7 factors of enlightenment in Buddhism. The 7 rays is a similar kind of concept, but it's just comes from a little bit different angle. And one of the ways that it's different is that we don't really want to associate just a single quality with each of these principles. The energies associated, for instance, with each chakra, or the essence of each ray, is really a multifaceted reality, a multifaceted principle. So, for instance, the 4th ray is associated with the heart chakra. And Alice Bailey, for instance, gave it the name harmony through conflict. And there's certainly a truth to that. But other qualities that are associated with that chakra particularly also, for instance, would be peace and bliss and compassion and love. These are also important aspects of the 4th ray as well. So to have a full expression of understanding the 4th ray, it's really to understand a variety of interconnected qualities that are particularly resonant with that ray, if you will, or chakra. Yes, that's a good question. Where is love in the 7 factors of enlightenment model? Well, that would be one of my critiques of that model, is that it doesn't include love. The Buddha, of course, included love in other contexts in his teachings, but specifically within the context of the 7 factors, which I think is a very important context. He didn't specifically talk about love. Probably the factor or quality that's closest to love or would include love would be rapture. But I don't think that that's really an ideal way to bring out that quality or emphasize it. So it's kind of in there. In a certain sense, it's also part of effort, oddly, because one way to think about that is that when we engage in spiritual practice, the basic motivation that we have is either we're seeking to heal, to awaken, to mature, to integrate, to enlighten ourselves, which is an act of love. So effort in personal awakening is a loving motivation. And also, if our motivation is such as, in the context of Buddhism, is bodhisattvic, then it's bodhicitta. It's the spirit of dedicating our path to the awakening of all beings. In either case, you could say that effort is a form of active love. It's self-love and it's universal love. So you could make the argument that love is part of that in the form of effort. But I think that's true, but it's also not maybe the ideal word to get across. Effort can have a specific feeling of its own, where sometimes it just feels like, for instance, at a time when we're taking an action that needs to require a certain discipline, for instance, there's a quality, the felt experience of effort in that moment feels more, doesn't often feel as much like love, the way we normally understand that word, as it does like just this other word, effort, intention, commitment, discipline, these kind of willful qualities. So I think there's an important value in making those distinctions because ultimately we find a way in which these qualities are deeply interconnected. We can see how they all ultimately interrelate. But on a normal human and spiritual level of experience, they do feel different. Peace and wisdom and effort and equanimity don't quite feel the same. They're good descriptions for different facets of this one reality of enlightenment. So we want on a practical, grounded human level to make these distinctions. And on that level, love just isn't one of the 7 factors of enlightenment. I think it needs to be there. So that's why I don't emphasize the 7 factors as my version of the 7 rays, for instance. It's not complete to me. It's missing qualities, it's missing devotion also, for instance. So it's an interesting system. I think it's a valuable one, but it's not, to my mind, a comprehensive one. It's not a complete description of human nature or human enlightenment. Well, why don't we take a 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and do a meditation, and then we can continue with our topic. Okay. Let's have a meditation. So taking some time to settle in. Bring your awareness to your body. Just relaxing, becoming more present. And paying attention to the simple quality of being. Just being present. and being aware of how the quality of your awareness itself is so intimately connected with just being. Let your awareness be more spacious. Just letting go. Just a spacious embrace of what is in this moment. Accepting everything as it is. Bring your body within your awareness, like a large spaciousness that contains your body. Accepting your body, just being at peace with your body. Accepting your whole human nature, your emotions, your personality traits. Just being with the basic reality of your human nature and being spacious and accepting. Feel a growing warmth in your awareness. Subtle feeling of warmth that envelops your body. So that there's not only awareness and spaciousness and acceptance, but love and warmth toward your physical body. And indeed towards your whole personality. Extend that sense of acceptance towards all of life around you, your whole life. Humanity. Our planet as a whole. Just for the moment, letting go of all concerns and judgments and fears. Just trying to settle deeper into a feeling of being okay, being at peace with everything. Now bringing your awareness back to your physical body more. Retaining that sense of spaciousness and acceptance. Extend your awareness into a stronger sense of feeling connected to your body, present within your body. So that you're both incarnate in your body and spacious at the same time. Use your sense of feeling to extend your awareness throughout your whole body. Strengthening a sensation of being fully integrated with your body. Incarnate in your whole body. You can move your awareness throughout your body gradually to extend your awareness to each part. Strengthen your connection to that part of your body. Be particularly aware now of your core, from the base of your spine to the top of your head. Sense or imagine the 7 chakras there. and feel yourself in harmony with all of them. Feel love and peace and light manifesting in all of the chakras. Feel a deep sense of wholeness. And feel that wholeness and warmth and peace extending out from your body, your presence, out into the world, blessing the world around you. And when you're ready, open your eyes. begin by seeing if there's anything that anyone would like to share from the meditation or questions about the meditation. Or if there's any questions that are carried over from the first half before the break.
I do have a question.
Great.
From the first half. Well, I'm so much on the same page of everything you said about the non-dual. Your comments about the non-dual you and but something I thought about was let's say a very developed being who chooses to incarnate, and one could say that these great beings, or well, who knows how great they are, let's just say some fifth initiate or sixth initiate or whatever, that they are incarnating out of their love for humanity. That even at those levels we somehow feel incomplete and not completely whole, so that even we are able to transcend and establish ourselves firmly in the transcendent realms, still there's some urge to come back and to somehow make ourselves more on an individual level, however great that individual is on that level. Still one has a need to come back and maybe integrate even more. So the point is, could there be even a selfish motive in coming back? So that actually, you know, we do on that level, the selfish motive is to become whole. But of course that self is inherently one with everything. So there's no real selfishness, but there is still, on the personal level, there's some sort of selfishness. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this is a very mysterious topic. It gets into something that's very, very much blending over into the realm of the inconceivable, you might say. So I just want to say that as a preface, because, you know, it's a little bit dangerous territory. But I'll share my feeling about that as far as that goes. To me, there are two basic realms, to use the Buddhist terminology. Let's say there is, let's just call it nirvana, and then there is samsara. And nirvana isn't someplace else. It's a state of realization and being. So it's not about going somewhere to attain this state. It's really the best way that I'm inclined to describe it is that it's a state of realizing the interdependence of all being. And the result of that is that we don't experience ourselves as separate beings. And so we experience a sense of profound, and then this is where it's difficult to put it into words, but for lack of a better term, wholeness, bliss, completeness. But the thing is that this realization of nirvana isn't something that is something that happens within relativity, within samsara. In other words, only beings in suffering and ignorance need to have wisdom. Brahman, in its transcendent nature, is eternally whole. So it's not about Brahman realizing something, it's about samsaric beings realizing something. And so for me, when a being realizes nirvana, there's two aspects to that. There's an aspect that it's about the direct appreciation of Brahman or the Tao or Buddha nature. But it also happens to a being that's still part of samsara, otherwise there'd be no value to it. There'd be no ignorance and then awakening. So in order for it to be happening within samsara, that being must still be somehow participating in samsara. And for me, the attainment of nirvana is the point where that being transitions to being so immersed in the realization of Brahman that the personal sense of being separate is transformed. But as long as that being still manifests in a mind and a body, and I mean those in the broadest possible terms, including intuition and everything else, those minds and bodies are interdependent with the rest of samsara. So they're still going to be a little bit tainted with samsara. And so in order to continue to have a mind and a body so that you can relate to sentient beings and participate in other people's awakening, you have to take on a little bit of the disease yourself, or else you won't have a mind and a body, and then you won't be perceptible to them, and you can't affect them, so to speak. And so you can transform the disease into the cure, so to speak, into this very beautiful, luminous wisdom and love and peace and compassion. But it's still, even that doesn't have any meaning unless it's compassion about something. There has to be some awareness of samsara and imperfection. So it's kind of like, in a sense, inherent in compassion is being willing to feel the ignorance, the suffering, the alienation, and the dukkha of samsara. And so that part of our nature that's willing to continue to feel that will continue to feel like it wants to keep liberating it. It has to. And so we can transform our personal version of that in such a way that it turns into a collective feeling of participation. But in a certain sense, like you're saying, it's still selfish in that it's kind of like we transform our individual desire for liberation into feeling compassionate connection with the universal desire for liberation, which is still a self, a separate self, a bunch of separate selves wanting to be liberated. So in that sense, it still has a selfish energy in it. But what we mean by compassion is when our individual version of that is turned into the solution, relating to and having compassion for the ongoing presence of other beings that experience that. So it gets very mysterious and deeply, trans-rational, ordinary. And in a certain sense, part of what a bodhisattva is, you might say, is a being eternally contemplating the mystery of that, and deepening the subtlety of their tremendous appreciation and comprehension and intuitive actualization of that mystery. So I'll stop there. One could talk for a long time about such things, but does that relate to what you were sharing?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it makes sense that that the motive to come back is your expanded self now includes many cells, individual cells, or smaller individuals, and so that greater desire for liberation is now the sum total of a vast number of beings' wish to liberate.
Yes. And you've sort of taken that into yourself and combined it with the nirvana so that it becomes this hybrid state where it's the two relating within through you, through your individuality.
Var det lækkert? Hvad skat? Det var lækkert. Det var mus mus.
Yeah, in a certain sense, I think there's a version of that that might not even be a question of coming back or even a choice, but really just a truth that's realized that there is no, when we think about it, if non-dual realization really means transcending the sense that we're a separate being, how could a separate being go off into nirvana if it doesn't think of itself as separate anymore? So at that point, you just become part of an interdependent consciousness, realizing its interdependent awakening. And so bodhisattvahood, in my opinion, is more like a type of wisdom of realizing a deeper truth rather than a choice. If somebody feels that they've gone off into nirvana, I think there's a subtle form of misunderstanding that's still happening. And that what it means that they've come back later, so to speak, is simply that they've outgrown that misunderstanding and are now experiencing a new phase of their awakening, their evolution. Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions, contributions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah. It is concerning what you were talking about qualities.
Okay.
Qualities. And I was thinking about whether you could see, for instance, peace or love as a passive and an active, in an active version. So, for instance, I feel that it's quite easy to cultivate peace when I'm alone or in a meditation. But then when I meet people and my, for instance, solar plexus reacts, then it's hard to cultivate the peace. So for me, there is this division, kind of, the active part and the passive part. And for me, maybe it has something to do with the fact that I come from the angelic kingdom and there the beingness and peace is more passive maybe for me. So the question is, could there be this division between what you are learning, for instance, I could learn more active and or love, for instance. You get the question? Yeah, okay.
I think I understand. I think for me, part of that issue has something to do with the difference between meditation and a little echo there, day-to-day activity, where as we develop spiritual qualities, it's often easier to begin to develop those qualities in meditation and gain access to them. And then because of challenges of day-to-day life, when we become active, it's a little harder to hold those qualities. So there's usually some kind of a gap. And it doesn't matter what stage of development, there's always some degree of gap. But we can get to a stage, for instance, where let's say at a certain stage of our development, we have a certain amount of peace in our meditation. And then in our day-to-day life, it's less so. But then 5 years later, the amount of peace we have in our day-to-day life might be equal to about where we were 5 years earlier in our meditation. But because of that, now that we have more peace in our day-to-day life, our meditations go even deeper, so it'll always be ahead. But what we can bring in terms of love and peace and contentment into our day-to-day life is always catching up. It's always, getting more. So that's one part of it. Also, there's this element of certain types of souls that are here are less familiar with the physical world too. So that isn't an extra challenge to bring spiritual qualities. It's a less familiar process for some souls because of their background before they've, how many times have they been here, or what particular kind of spiritual background do they have before becoming human, or even in between human lives. There's some souls that have been around for a while in the human kingdom, but they incarnate infrequently. And there's long periods, sometimes 1,000 years between lives or more. And so, again, that kind of poses an additional challenge of that there's a stronger inner development of these qualities, and there's not as much sort of practice and experience with integrating them in the physical world. And in a certain sense, that's part of what the seventh ray means, is the seventh ray is related to the physical earth element, physical body, physical plane, earth, like root chakra and so on. So in one sense, each of the rays has very much to do with the integration of our spiritual consciousness and presence into a particular dimension of experience. And so in a certain sense, when we're physically incarnate as human beings, a big part of the curriculum in that life is to enhance our seventh ray aspect, which might not seem quite as, it has many aspects. It doesn't mean just whatever we think the seventh ray means. Like, say, for me, it means a kind of groundedness and a practicality and a discipline and organization and these kind of qualities that pertain to kind of what it feels like to bring spirituality into the most dense and substantial aspect of our experience. But it also is about bringing every other aspect of our nature into expression there. So it's seventh ray is each ray becomes a doorway through which each of the other qualities needs to express as well. So that's another piece of it, in a sense, coming here, not just for beings who with unusual backgrounds, other kinds of souls, but even for your ordinary human being, each moment of physical incarnation is a time in the phase of that soul's experience where it's very much, challenged to grow in, among other things, that seventh ray foundational quality of groundedness. And there's a lot to be said actually about that. That could do like a class on the seven rays and do 2 hours on each ray and really go into what it's all about. But briefly, I think that's a good. Do you want to follow up with anything that we've just talked about, or does that feel like we addressed it?
Well,
oh, I'm not hearing you at the moment. Let's see. Okay. Want to try again? No, still not hearing. Are you muted on your end, perhaps?
Jo, der var den. Der var den. Nu er den unmuted.
Well,
Det er fordi,
now
det der.
it just took some time to unmute.
There we go. Okay.
So the follow-up is that also in the vibration, for instance, piece, it could be a passive and an active. For instance, a passive piece is more absorbing, where I feel an active piece is more inborn.
Yes,
So
I agree. I think that can be part of the issue too, is that one way to talk about it is that each ray, and in fact, I think, to some extent we could say each spiritual quality that we could identify has an active and receptive aspect to it. So for instance, love in its receptive mode is, say, more like compassion, but in its active mode would be, say, generosity and, a spirit of active, like for instance, if we are consciously radiating positivity into the world around us, that's a more active mode of love. But if we're consciously feeling the suffering of the world in a compassionate way, that's a more receptive type of love. So it sounds like perhaps you're sensing that maybe there's in your history a greater connection to the receptive mode, and that is part of that challenge. Is that right?
yes, I've seen it among many Indian people that we have this. We like the passive versions of the vibrations because we have this problem with activity in a physical plane. So, so yes.
Yes, I understand what you mean. Yeah. Okay. I saw a few questions coming up in the chat, so let me take a moment to okay. That question was from a while ago. I think, hopefully we addressed some of these already. Question about what Liv is asking, what are the more usual time between incarnations, do I think? That's a big topic. The short version of that, let me find the mute button here for a moment. Yeah, there we go. Is I think it does vary quite a bit from person to person. At one end of the spectrum, I think we do see instances where people can spend at least centuries, if not millennia, out of incarnation. At the other extreme end of the spectrum, there are certain souls that are never out of incarnation because they have more than one body and incarnation at the same time. And so, given that there's two or more bodies simultaneously in incarnation, they usually overlap, and so there's never a point in which that soul is not currently in incarnation. But this is a little bit, that's quite a bit more rare. That's usually bodhisattvas that are very strongly involved in service to the earth, but so that's pretty rare. So somewhere in the middle, my feeling is that it generally ranges between decades and a few centuries. So it's not uncommon for a soul to come back within 10 or 20 years, but it's also not uncommon for them to wait 100 or 200 years. In terms of an average, I don't know if I ever really tried to attune to a sense of an average, but I would say it's somewhere in between those. So we're not talking about the average soul coming back within a handful of years or 500 or 1,000 years. It's probably more in the 50 to 150 year zone. Okay. So, any other questions from before or what we're currently talking about? Let me unmute here first in case. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, let me, got about 15 more minutes or so. From the tantric point of view, there's an interesting relationship that's we talked about, and I will return to I'll just take up the subject a little bit more right now, and that's the relationship between the elements and the rays. One of the ways of understanding the nature of the distinction between different basic aspects of human nature, like our physical body, or our emotional nature, and mental nature, and so on, or the different chakras as energy centers in the body, is that they're related to these different elements that we've talked about a little bit already. And the one way of understanding the rays is if, as we experience involvement in these dimensions of experience that are distinguished by the basic element that is dominant there, like the way the earth element is dominant in the physical world and the water element in the astral plane and so on, is that as we experience these different dimensions, we gain wisdom about that dimension of experience. And the essence of this wisdom is ultimately at its deepest level the same. It's the primordial wisdom of enlightenment itself. But because wisdom also has a relative aspect, wisdom reflects specific contexts. So that, for instance, if let's say we have human life experience where we are dealing with a particular personality trait which we're seeking to work through the issues around that, we might gain a specific kind of wisdom about that dynamic. And at another time, if we're working with a different kind of issue, some of the same things might apply. Like, for instance, wisdom about the way our desires affect our state of mind, and the way specific desires can lead to suffering, because if we're out of harmony with the reality of how things are, and we desire, by desiring it to be different than that, then we suffer. This type of wisdom of the basic insights into the nature of desire and how it leads to suffering, that's universal. That can be applied to all kinds of situations. But the situations also vary, and so some of the specific details of the type of wisdom, like if I have, let's say, an addiction, and I work through issues around that and I gain some wisdom, I not only can gain some essential spiritual wisdom from that, but I can also gain very practical wisdom about ways that I got over addiction, and ways I could help other people get over addiction, and that's part of the wisdom too. But it's, in some ways, some of that's kind of specific to that situation. Well, the rays are very much like that. In a sense, the rays are just 7 basic situations, and the types of wisdom and virtue and capacities that arise as we become enlightened in that specific situation. So the 7th ray specifically relates to that aspect of enlightenment that arises in relationship to the earth element and the physical world. And the sixth ray to the emotional, psychic, or psychological, if you will, especially with regard to sentiments and feelings and desires and emotions. Each of the rays is that. It's both essential enlightenment, but it's also flavored or colored by a specific aspect of experience. And since there are these 7 basic elements and 7 basic worlds, 7 basic aspects of human nature, we get these 7 basic dimensions of enlightenment. I mentioned earlier that in Tibetan Buddhism, they call these wisdom luminosities, and there's a discussion of the way in which the elements, for instance, a given element like the fire element is transformed into its wisdom luminosity. That's essentially exactly a description of the nature of the rays. And part of the relationship then is that it's not, from a tantric point of view, ordinary experience pertaining to different chakras or aspects of our experience get transformed into their corresponding wisdom luminosity, or ray, if you will. So at the heart of all of the rays is essentially the same core wisdom, the wisdom of our true nature, the wisdom of the nature of reality, and the core wisdom about distinguishing between that and misunderstandings, like the experience of being a separate and alienated being, the confusion of feeling that we are incomplete unless we acquire things, or the belief that that we need other people or other things or life to be a particular way in order to feel whole or complete. Our true nature is intrinsically whole and complete, and so it's part of essential fundamental spiritual wisdom to realize our capacity for wholeness, and therefore for a deeper kind of love and harmony through realizing that. And then we can break wisdom down into its sort of finer details, the specific aspects of it, and that's where we get this notion of the 7 rays, as part of which is well, in essence, it's both about the active and receptive qualities, wisdoms, and capacities that relate to that aspect of experience and reality. Now, another important aspect of the rays is that because we're the part of our being, like all of us have a deeper spiritual self, and that part makes its sort of home base, you might say, on a spiritual plane. And in between incarnations, we not only withdraw to the astral plane, where we have an astral body and we continue to have experiences, and we continue to review our life and assimilate wisdom from our past incarnation. And gradually we reawaken to our deeper self, and eventually we move out of the astral plane into our mental body and continue to have experiences, continue to have opportunities to serve and to grow spiritually. We can engage in spiritual practices in these dimensions and so on. But eventually we'll withdraw into our soul, and that's the part of us that's beyond form. That's the part of us that's the sum total of all the wisdom we've had, not only from our human incarnations, but from the periods in between incarnations and other kinds of experiences as well. So at that point, we're absorbed into this deeper self, and we'll kind of remember our larger nature. We can remember our past lives. And there's a whole kind of life, in a sense, that part of our nature participates in. when we come into human incarnation, it's not as though that part comes from some other world and leaves that world and comes here. Instead, it kind of like a flashlight projecting a beam, it emanates a presence of consciousness and being and intentionality into the bodies, where that consciousness mixes with those bodies and forms a human personality. But at the same time, the deep self, the spiritual self, so to speak, remains, continues to function on that level as in its own sort of dimension, if you will. So it's sort of a dual focus then, and then as the incarnation completes and it works its way through the subtler bodies, it kind of reabsorbs all the experience and digests that and transforms it all into wisdom and qualities. So while we're in incarnation, these other levels of our nature continue to exist, even parts of our nature that are subtler and exist in other dimensions beyond the soul or higher self as well. Excuse me. As we grow spiritually, all of these centers, all of these aspects of our nature kind of grow in their awareness and expand in such a way that they overlap and finally integrate all with each other all at the same time. So the final goal is to discover a kind of more radically fundamental part of our nature that's beyond all of these levels. Call it our Buddha nature, or that part of our nature that is one with Brahman, one with the Absolute, one with God. So another way of talking about what's happening then is that we're cultivating a type of wisdom that correlates to each of these levels, but there's also a part of our nature that's integrating it up all at the same time. Our true, deeper, higher self is the part of us that's gaining wisdom and spiritual qualities from its experience in all of these dimensions at the same time. So again, I'm going to pause at that point and see if there's any, coming to the end of class today. I want to just take a second and see if there's any questions about, this is a big topic, and I want to continue with this in the future. But one of the things that the directions we can take this is to break it down and also into the way these different qualities show up as specific spiritual paths, and why people have often basic different leanings in the direction of different spiritual practices. Like, in the Hindu tradition, a very common simple distinction is bhakti and jnani, which is devotional versus wisdom. But there are other subdivisions that actually only really incorporates two main rays. And so we could say that there's really 7 primary paths that people can be on, both in a given instant and also as a soul across many lives. And that can be very useful to understand too, what that looks like. So we'll go into that further. But before we conclude, I just want to see if there's any other qualities about, questions about what we've talked about so far.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
It's about concerning what you were just talking about the afterlife when you withdraw through the inner body, the astral body, and the mental body. I was wondering, how long does you stay attached to the ego in the afterlife? Where does that sort of stop being there? Is that when you withdraw to the soul?
In a sense, that has more to do with the level of development of the soul. Say, for instance, if the person is a third-degree initiate, then there is a very subtle form of spiritual ego, you could call it, that's natural for a third-degree initiate to have. So when they sit down to meditate, it's very easy for them to slip out of that into a non-dual state of presence. But in their ordinary state, they come back into this very refined type of spiritual personality, you might say, that has a strong sense of wholeness and interconnectedness, but it's not fully developed non-dual realization yet. And even though we call it ego, sometimes it can be kind of proud. There can be, maybe the person feels a little bit proud about being spiritually mature, or maybe they have wisdom and they feel a superiority, or maybe they're a bhakti and they think, my God's better than yours, and a little bit of spiritual ego in their religion or whatever. So these kind of things can be there. For such a person, when they leave incarnation, they're likely to fairly quickly, it's similar to going into meditation, they'll just go right into a more non-dual state, and that subtle ego will fall away, often just immediately, as they pass over. For the average person, though, they'll spend time in their astral body, sometimes years, not uncommonly years. And there's just, in a sense, there's a whole aspect of human life that actually takes place after we die. That's kind of, if we think of life as a circle, let's see, I'll have to do it in a way that you can see it on the screen there. Think of at the top, not that there's really any up or down, is the spiritual, the higher self. And then we come down into the bodies and incarnate. And then there's a period of time where we're born, and then a whole cycle where we're in incarnation. And then we complete the circle, and gradually over a period of time, we reassimilate back into the higher self. During that, in a sense, the whole incarnation is all of those segments. It's not just the time when we're in incarnation. It also includes this important phase after we leave incarnation, where lots takes place for a lot of people. Depends on the person, how long they stay there. Usually it's anywhere from seconds, like a very enlightened being might just skip right over that and absorb back into their deep self. And just, but more often, even if they're a great soul, they might want to do work in those planes and serve. So, for instance, it's common if they were a spiritual teacher, they'll spend at least decades there helping their students that are still in incarnation, or those that have passed over in these intermediate dimensions too. So it's possible to just skip over that if you're very advanced. More often, there's still some time spent there. And then for the average soul, it can range from usually years to decades, and even in some rare cases, centuries. The latter being mostly either because of service, that person's a bodhisattva, and that's just, they're going to be on the astral plane for several hundred years doing their next phase of work. Or in some cases, people can be so attached and involved in their personality still that they not only don't realize that they've died, but they try to continue their life because there's a replica of everything that they experienced in the physical world on the astral plane. So they have the same house, they go to work, they think they have to drive their car, and it's like they're dreaming, and they just create this whole reality. And some people can be so attached and so involved in that it can last for 100 years or more of that. So part of the work that some spiritual, servers do is they kind of go around on the astral plane and look for these people and try to educate them. Do you understand that you're not alive in a physical body anymore? Educate them about what's happening. Sometimes they listen. Sometimes they're reluctant. In one instance, it took me probably a half an hour of conversation with the fellow to get him to, which isn't that bad really, but he didn't just get it right away. I had to explain, and point out things about, he acknowledged through conversation that he wasn't really eating anymore. So I reminded him. So, let's say 5 years ago, did you find that you could just go for long periods of time, like months at a time, and not eat? And that jarred his, he started to, the way when the average person dreams, they don't know that they're dreaming, and they don't necessarily stop acting as if they're in a physical body. They have meals, and they walk when they want to go somewhere instead of just traveling at the speed of thought. They still function in the same way. So similarly, a lot of people do the same thing, and then that same way that dreams can be kind of foggy, and you don't know you're dreaming. If a person doesn't know that they've died, and they're not even reasoning that well, then they don't notice this difference. And suddenly, just in a way that they didn't notice it, they just kind of stopped eating, but they didn't compare it and realize. Well, so when I pointed out these things, he acknowledged that he was walking through walls and doors, or that he wasn't eating anymore. And so I showed him, wow, and he realized, oh, that's interesting, and his awakening started. So in those kind of cases, that can be part of the reason why it can last for a long time, that it can be decades, or even in rare cases longer than that. But mostly, my sense is it's kind of in the range of years to decades that people will spend, say, in the astral body, probably most commonly years, and then move on to the mental plane and beyond. I think I saw. Do you think we incarnate? Any follow-up, by the way, to that?
No, thank you very much.
Okay. So let me just take this last question, and then we'll. Do you think we incarnate as group souls and maybe remember lives lived by someone else in the group? Yeah, I do. Yes to both of those questions. We certainly are part of group souls. That has to do with the concept of rays that we were talking about earlier. So we'll actually come back to that later. And sometimes through affinity, yes, we can be close enough to another person that we can kind of pick up on their life experiences and occasionally misinterpret them as our own. Or sometimes people will remember somebody from another incarnation that they knew in that life, but mistake that as who they were. There's different ways that occasionally people can get confused. To really have accurate memory of past lives takes a fairly mature amount of spiritual development, with an ability to with a great clarity and concentration and intuition to look closely and examine these things. So a lot of people, regardless of stage of development, it's not uncommon for past life memories to come to the surface sometimes. But it's also sometimes possible for there to be misunderstandings and confusion about that until a person gets more advanced. So I think it's about time, by the way, to plan out the next class. So I just wanted to mention we had previously talked about that the next class would be about the world situation. And so I just wanted to mention, as I conclude the class today, that I'm going to go about setting that up now. It seems like when I've asked before, people didn't want to take too much of a break in between classes. We ended up on just taking, I guess, 1 week off last time. Does that still feel like that works for people to fairly efficiently move on to the next? Let's see. Let me move to the gallery view. I see some thumbs up, and okay, generally yes. So I'll take that as a yes. Should we move right on into the next one without a break, or maybe take a week off? Any preference there? Is that I see some fingers from Linda and Johnny. Does that mean take 1 week off, or no? It doesn't. Okay. All right. Well, feel free to email me too if you have any follow-up thoughts about that. But I'm not going to decide right this moment. But it looks like either immediately or taking a week off resonates with people. So now I see more on no breaks. Okay, good. Well, thank you all for being here. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Namaste.
Bye-bye.